In 1881, foreign bankers walked into Istanbul and seized control of the Ottoman Empire's finances, not through war, not through invasion, through debt. They installed the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a shadow government run by European creditors, and gave it authority over the empire's tax revenues: salt taxes, tobacco taxes, fishing taxes, stamp duties, all collected by foreigners and sent directly to bondholders in London, Paris, and Vienna. The Ottoman government watched its own money flow out of the country before it could spend a single coin on its military, its roads, or its people. The empire didn't lose sovereignty on a battlefield. It surrendered it in a ledger. This wasn't punishment for losing a war. It was the inevitable conclusion of two decades of borrowing, currency manipulation, and political paralysis. The Ottomans believed they could borrow indefinitely. They believed their power made them immune to the rules that governed lesser nations. They were wrong. By the time they realized debt wasn't just numbers on paper, it was a noose tightening around their sovereignty, it was too late. The money was gone. The creditors were in control. The empire was finished. Right now, the United States is following the same script. For decades, the Ottoman Empire refused to borrow from Europe, not because they were financially disciplined, but because they understood what debt meant: dependence. Once you owe foreign creditors, your decisions are no longer entirely your own. The moment you need their money to survive, they own a piece of your sovereignty. Ottoman officials knew this. They resisted external loans even when the empire was struggling financially. They preferred currency debasement, debasing the AKC and piaster by reducing the silver content, over foreign debt. It destroyed the currency's value, but at least the destruction was domestic. At least they controlled it. That resistance ended in 1854. The Crimean War demanded resources the empire didn't have. Military expenses were escalating. The treasury was empty. The Ottoman government needed capital immediately, and Europe's banks were ready to provide it. The first public loan was taken. It felt manageable, a temporary measure to cover wartime costs. But once the door opened, it never closed. Loans followed in 1858, 1860, 1862, 1863, 1865. By the 1870s, the empire was borrowing multiple times per year. Each loan was justified as necessary. Each was supposed to be the last. None of them were. The problem wasn't just the borrowing, it was what made the borrowing necessary. The Ottoman tax system was broken. Revenue collection was decentralized, controlled by provincial governors, valis and pashas, who operated with minimal oversight. These officials were supposed to send collected taxes to the central government. Instead, they kept portions for themselves, used funds to consolidate local power, and submitted incomplete records. The central treasury never knew how much money it actually had. Budget planning was impossible. Expenses were approved without knowing if revenue could cover them. Deficits became structural, not accidental. When revenue couldn't meet obligations, the empire borrowed. When borrowed funds ran out, they borrowed again. By 1875, the Ottoman government owed more to foreign creditors than any other debtor nation on earth. The debt wasn't just large, it was unserviceable. Annual debt payments exceeded the government's capacity to collect revenue. The spiral had become irreversible. Before the foreign loans consumed the empire, the Ottomans tried to solve the problem internally. If the government couldn't collect enough taxes, it would manipulate the currency. Debasement became fiscal policy. The exchange rate for piasters to one British pound sterling stood at 19 in 1808. By 1839, it had surged to 106. This wasn't inflation caused by economic growth or external shocks. This was deliberate currency destruction to generate government revenue. The logic was straightforward: reduce the metallic content of coins, issue them at the same face value, and pocket the difference. It worked in the short term. It generated funds without raising taxes or confronting the corrupt provincial governors. But it destroyed confidence in Ottoman money. Merchants began refusing coins at face value. International trade required foreign currency. Domestic transactions reverted to bartering in regions where the currency had become worthless. The economy fractured. Eventually, even this destructive tool was abandoned. The decision to stop debasing the currency without fixing the underlying budget deficits removed the government's last internal mechanism for covering shortfalls. That's when the foreign borrowing accelerated. If they couldn't print their way out of insolvency, they had to borrow their way into it. The shift from internal debasement to external debt was a choice between two forms of destruction. They chose the one that felt less immediate. They chose wrong. By the 1870s, inflation from wars and continued fiscal mismanagement compounded the currency's collapse. High inflation signaled to foreign creditors that the empire couldn't manage its finances. Interest rates on new loans increased. Terms became more extractive. The debt spiral fed on itself. Borrowing caused inflation. Inflation raised borrowing costs. Higher costs required more borrowing. The cycle was self-reinforcing and terminal. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman Empire declared a partial default on its foreign loans. It wasn't a strategic decision, it was a confession of insolvency. Debt payments had far exceeded the government's capacity to service them. The global financial crisis that began in 1873 dried up new lending. Military costs from internal rebellions and external conflicts drained what little revenue remained. The empire was out of options. The default triggered immediate mobilization from European creditors. British, French, Austrian, German, and Italian bondholders demanded repayment. They didn't care about Ottoman sovereignty or internal struggles. They cared about their investment. Negotiations began. The empire offered restructuring plans. Creditors rejected them. The Ottomans proposed reduced payments. Creditors demanded guarantees. The negotiations dragged on for years. The empire was bargaining from a position of total weakness. In December 1881, the decree of Muharrem formalized the creditors' terms. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration was established, a bureaucracy controlled entirely by European bondholders. It wasn't a lone restructuring committee. It was a parallel government. The OPDA was granted authority to collect over 1/4 of Ottoman state revenue and distribute it directly to creditors. The empire had no say in how the money was spent. It was collected, recorded, and sent abroad before the Ottoman treasury could touch it. The specific revenue sources ceded to the OPDA reveal the depth of the surrender: monopolies on salt and tobacco, stamp duties, spirits taxes, fishing taxes, and the silk tithe. These weren't symbolic concessions. They were the empire's most reliable sources of domestic revenue. Salt and tobacco were necessities. Every household in the empire consumed them. By ceding control of these monopolies, the Ottomans ensured that the average citizen's daily purchases funded foreign creditors before funding the state. At its peak, the OPDA employed up to 9,000 officials, more staff than the Ottoman Empire's own Ministry of Finance. It operated with full legal authority to enforce tax collection, punish evasion, and manage revenue flows. Ottoman officials became bystanders in their own fiscal system. The debt was eventually reduced from £191 million to $106 million through restructuring, and the OPDA successfully serviced payments, £113 million paid out between 1882 and 1914. But the solvency was achieved by sacrificing sovereignty. The empire was financially occupied. The United States national debt has increased every year for over a decade. By the end of fiscal year 2025, debt held by the public is projected to reach $30.1 trillion. The debt-to-GDP ratio has reached 122%, higher than the World War II peak and climbing. Unlike past debt spikes tied to wars or recessions, the current trajectory is sustained during economic expansion. The debt isn't a crisis response, it's structural. The primary drivers are mandatory spending programs, Social Security and Medicare, and interest costs accelerating faster than revenues. These aren't discretionary budget items that can be cut with a vote. They're legally mandated obligations that grow automatically as the population ages and healthcare costs rise. Revenue growth hasn't kept pace. Tax policy debates focus on cuts and credits, not increases that might close the gap. The result is deficits during growth, deficits during recession, deficits indefinitely. For years, low interest rates masked the danger. When the government could borrow at near zero rates, even massive debt seemed manageable. But interest rates have risen sharply. Net interest costs in 2022 were $476 billion. By 2025, they're projected to reach $1.2 trillion. More than doubling in 3 years. Interest payments now consume 17% of total federal spending. The government is spending more on debt service than on defense, more than on children's programs, more than on most discretionary priorities. This is automatic austerity. The nation's policy choices are constrained not by democratic debate, but by bond servicing requirements. Interest payments are projected to consume 18.4% of federal revenues by the end of 2025. That means nearly 1 in every $5 collected by the government goes directly to creditors before a single policy decision is made. Roads, schools, military, healthcare, all must compete for what's left after interest is paid. The debt isn't just a number. It's a claim on future resources that diminishes the government's capacity to act. Foreign holders own $9.1 trillion of U.S. debt, 32% of all debt held by the public. While U.S. Treasuries are considered the world's safest investment, this dependence creates geopolitical vulnerability. The composition of foreign holdings has shifted. China has gradually reduced its treasury holdings. Japan and the United Kingdom have increased theirs. Even close allies can use debt holdings as leverage in trade negotiations or diplomatic disputes. The reliance on external capital creates a constraint where financial decisions intersect with foreign policy. This mirrors the Ottoman experience. Decades before the OPDA was established, European creditors used Ottoman debt to influence foreign policy. The empire's need for continued lending forced it to accommodate European political demands. The debt became a tool of soft power, control without occupation. The United States isn't being occupied by creditors, but the need to maintain borrowing capacity does impose constraints. Policy decisions that might destabilize bond markets, default threats, debt ceiling brinkmanship, fiscal irresponsibility, trigger credit downgrades and market reactions that force corrections. In 2023, Fitch Ratings downgraded U.S. debt from AAA, citing expected fiscal deterioration and erosion of governance stemming from repeated debt ceiling standoffs. Moody's lowered its outlook to negative. These aren't symbolic actions. Credit ratings affect borrowing costs. Downgrades mean higher interest rates. Higher rates mean more money spent on debt service, deepening the fiscal hole. The spiral tightens. The Federal Reserve holds approximately $4.6 trillion in treasuries, a position that raises concerns about fiscal dominance. This occurs when a central bank compromises its monetary independence to support government fiscal sustainability. If the Fed must keep rates low to prevent a debt crisis, it loses the ability to control inflation effectively. This institutional self-compromise signals that market discipline is failing, and the government is relying on internal distortion to stay solvent, a form of hidden default where the central bank prints money to finance deficits, eroding currency value in slow motion. The advantage the United States has held for decades, borrowing in its own currency, creates both protection and danger. It means the government can never technically run out of money because it can always print more. But that capability becomes a trap. The temptation to inflate away debt obligations by expanding the money supply undermines the dollar's credibility. Once creditors suspect the government will choose inflation over repayment, they demand higher interest rates to compensate for currency risk. The protection becomes a vulnerability. The unique privilege that made U.S. debt seem safe transforms into the mechanism of its collapse. The United States hasn't established a foreign-run debt administration. There are no European officials collecting American taxes. But the loss of fiscal autonomy is real. It's just informal, decentralized, and market-driven. The constraint isn't imposed by a bureaucracy. It's imposed by interest rates, credit ratings, and bond market reactions. When policy decisions threaten fiscal stability, markets respond. Yields spike. Borrowing costs increase. The government is forced to adjust. This is surrender by mathematics. The Ottoman oppidum was visible, foreign officials with offices and staff. The American constraint is invisible but equally binding. Rising interest costs automatically crowd out other spending. Defense, infrastructure, education, all must shrink to make room for debt service, unless taxes rise or deficits expand further. Neither option is politically viable. So the constraint functions as automatic austerity. Priorities are dictated by bond servicing requirements, not by elected leaders. The parallels are structural. The Ottoman Empire borrowed to cover military expenses and administrative failures. The United States borrows to fund consumption, entitlements, and discretionary spending that benefit current generations at the expense of future ones. The Ottoman state debased its currency explicitly. The United States relies on Federal Reserve interventions and tolerates inflation spikes that erode purchasing power. The Ottoman government defaulted and surrendered fiscal control to creditors. The U.S. risks either slow stagnation from compounding interest or a catastrophic confidence crisis if creditors lose faith in repayment capacity. The table of comparison is clear. Borrowing catalyst, monetary collapse, debt burden metrics, and loss of sovereignty follow the same sequence. The mechanisms differ. 19th century imperialism versus 21st century market forces, but the outcome is identical. When a government cannot discipline its own fiscal policy, external forces impose that discipline. The empire that refuses to govern itself will be governed by its creditors. Sovereign debt crises aren't abstractions. They impose real costs on real people. In the Ottoman Empire, the OPDA's seizure of salt and tobacco monopolies meant that ordinary citizens paid taxes on necessities to foreign creditors. Their money left the country before funding domestic services. Corruption from local governors already burdened them. Now, foreign extraction compounded the injustice. The average Ottoman subject subsidized European bondholders with every purchase. In the United States, rising federal interest rates translate directly to higher borrowing costs for households. Mortgage rates rose from 2.8% to 7.8%. Credit card rates spiked from 14.8% to 21.8%. These increases are driven partly by federal fiscal failure, massive deficits forcing the Fed to raise rates to control inflation. The result is a consumer debt crisis. American household debt hit a record $18.59 trillion. Auto loan and credit card delinquencies are approaching levels unseen in over a decade. Student loan delinquencies reached a record 14.3% after the payment pause ended. The cost of federal fiscal irresponsibility falls on borrowers. Families trying to buy homes, finance cars, or pay for education face punitive interest rates driven by government debt dynamics. Wealth transfers from the average borrower to the creditor class, domestic and foreign, through compounding interest. This is the modern equivalent of the OPDA taxing salt and tobacco. The mechanism is decentralized, but the extraction is identical. The ultimate moral failure is intergenerational injustice. Current borrowing finances, current consumption, entitlements, tax cuts, discretionary spending, benefiting today's population. Future generations inherit the bill. Debt accumulation crowds out private investment by raising interest rates. Less investment means slower productivity growth. Lower productivity means reduced living standards. The decision to borrow rather than balance budgets is a conscious choice to sacrifice future prosperity for present comfort. It violates the foundational promise that each generation builds a better future than the last. In the Ottoman Empire, the governing class, corrupt provincial governors, and a paralyzed central administration chose short-term survival over long-term solvency. In the United States, political elites face the same incentive structure. There's no immediate political cost for ignoring the debt. There's significant risk in proposing solutions that require spending cuts or tax increases. So they choose silence. They choose gridlock. They choose to postpone the crisis until it's catastrophic. This is the shared moral failure, prioritizing political expediency over fiscal responsibility, ensuring that collapse, when it comes, is swift and total. The Ottoman Empire entered a debt spiral in 1854. By 1881, foreign creditors controlled its finances. The trajectory from first loan to fiscal occupation took 27 years. The United States has been accumulating unsustainable debt for over a decade. The timeline is compressing. The mechanisms are faster. The outcome follows the same logic. Two scenarios define the American future. The first is slow demise, sustained economic stagnation caused by massive, continuous interest payments crowding out productive investment. This is austerity by accident, automatic, unlegislated, imposed by arithmetic. Growth slows. Opportunity contracts. Living standards decline. The government retains formal sovereignty but loses practical autonomy as bond servicing requirements dictate all major fiscal decisions. The second is catastrophic crisis, a swift sovereign debt crisis triggered when creditors lose confidence in the nation's ability to service obligations. This would jeopardize the dollar's status as the global reserve currency and necessitate immediate, drastic austerity. Massive tax hikes and severe spending cuts imposed not by choice but by emergency. The political system would fracture. Markets would collapse. The transition would be brutal. Both paths end with loss of control. The first surrenders autonomy gradually, the second suddenly. But the surrender is identical. Fiscal policy dictated by external forces, not by elected representatives. The Ottoman OPDA was visible, a bureaucracy with offices, staff, and legal authority. The American constraint is invisible: market forces, interest rates, credit ratings. But the grip is just as tight. When a government cannot discipline itself, creditors will do it. The fundamental question is whether the United States can break the pattern. Can it impose fiscal discipline before external forces impose it? Can it raise revenues, cut spending, reform entitlements, and stabilize the debt trajectory before the crisis arrives? The political system shows no sign of that capability. Gridlock persists, deficits grow, interest costs accelerate. Every year of inaction makes the eventual correction more severe. History provides the answer. The Ottoman Empire believed it could borrow indefinitely. It believed its power made it exempt from the rules governing lesser states. It was wrong. Spain believed the same in the 16th century. Britain believed it in the 20th. All were wrong. The pattern doesn't care about exceptionalism. The mathematics are indifferent to national identity. You cannot spend beyond your means forever. You cannot service compounding interest indefinitely. You cannot avoid the endgame once the spiral is locked in. The United States is following the same script the Ottoman Empire followed 150 years ago: borrowing for consumption, currency manipulation through monetary policy, rising debt, service costs, dependence on foreign creditors, erosion of governance. The stages are identical. The mechanisms have modernized, but the trajectory hasn't changed. The Ottomans didn't see it coming until foreign officials were collecting their taxes. The Americans won't see it coming until the bond market forces austerity overnight or interest costs consume the entire budget. The warning signs are everywhere: credit downgrades, rising yields, political paralysis, mandatory spending consuming discretionary capacity, foreign creditors shifting holdings, the Federal Reserve trapped between controlling inflation and supporting treasury markets. Each indicator confirms the same diagnosis. The debt has become unmanageable. The trajectory has become irreversible. The endgame has become inevitable. The difference between the Ottoman collapse and the potential American crisis is scale. When the OPDA took control, it affected one empire. When the U.S. fiscal system breaks, it affects the global economy. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. U.S. treasuries are the foundation of international finance. A sovereign debt crisis in America wouldn't be contained. It would cascade through every economy, every market, every financial institution that holds dollars or dollar-denominated assets. The collapse would be global. The money will run out, or sovereignty will be surrendered. Those are the only two endings. The choice is when, not if, and the clock is running.